Elon Musk stops on the highway, his actions save a family's life. The hum of cars speeding down the highway created a rhythmic background noise, blending with the occasional roar of a motorcycle or the blaring horn of a frustrated driver. It was late afternoon, and the golden light of the setting sun bathed the road in a soft glow. Elon Musk, clad in his usual black jacket and jeans, sat behind the wheel of his Tesla Model S Plaid, a vehicle he loved to take for unannounced solo drives. Today was supposed to be one of those drives, a quiet moment of reflection after a long week. But as he cruised down the open stretch of highway, something caught his eye. Far ahead, just off to the side of the road, was a car pulled over on the shoulder. It wasn't unusual to see vehicles broken down on this stretch, but this one was different. A family, a woman, a man, and 2 young children, stood outside, their postures tense and uneasy. The man waved frantically at passing cars, his desperation evident even from a distance. Elon's instincts kicked in. Slowing down, he maneuvered the Tesla to the side of the road and brought it to a smooth stop a few feet behind the distressed family's car. As he stepped out, the subtle sound of the Tesla's door closing behind him seemed to make the scene feel even more immediate. The family turned to look at him, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Hi there," Elon said, his tone calm and approachable. "Do you need some help?" The man stepped forward, his face pale and his voice shaky. "Our car, it just died on us. And my wife, she's not feeling well." His eyes darted toward the woman, who was leaning against the car with one hand clutching her stomach. The 2 young children clung to her legs, their wide eyes filled with worry. Elon quickly assessed the situation. The car, a battered sedan with its hood propped open, was emitting thin wisps of smoke. The man was sweating despite the mild weather, and the woman's pallor suggested she might need immediate medical attention. "Have you called for help?" Elon asked, already glancing at the road behind them, where vehicles zipped past without slowing down. The man shook his head. "I tried, but the signal here is terrible. My phone keeps dropping the call." Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. "Let's see if mine works," he said, unlocking it with a swipe. As he dialed, the woman let out a soft groan, sinking further against the car. Elon glanced up, his brow furrowing. "She doesn't look well. Is she okay?" "She's pregnant," the man admitted, his voice breaking. "And she's been having pains for the last hour." Elon's focus sharpened instantly. This wasn't just a broken-down car, it was a family in crisis. He stepped closer to the woman, careful to maintain a calm demeanor. "Ma'am, I'm Elon. Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Her response was faint but clear. It's bad. I think I need a doctor." The tension was palpable now, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. Elon made a quick decision. "We can't wait for roadside assistance. She needs to get to a hospital immediately." The man looked at Elon with wide, panicked eyes. "But how? The car won't move, and He gestured helplessly at the highway, where cars continued to speed past without a second glance. "My Tesla can take you," Elon said firmly. "It's fully charged and fast enough to get you there quickly. Let's get her in." The man hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between the urgency of his wife's condition and the unfamiliarity of trusting a stranger. But then he nodded, his desperation winning out. "Okay, thank you." Elon wasted no time. He opened the back door of his Tesla, motioning for the man to help his wife inside. The children climbed in after her, their small faces etched with fear. Elon glanced back at the open hood of their broken car and made a mental note of its condition. The smoke had stopped, but the engine was clearly in bad shape. As Elon slid into the driver's seat and started the car, he glanced at the man, who was now in the passenger seat, clutching his phone tightly. "Do you know the nearest hospital?" "There's one about 15 miles from here," the man said, his voice trembling. "But I don't know how to." "Don't worry," Elon interrupted, his tone reassuring. "The Tesla's navigation will take us there. Just focus on staying calm." The car hummed to life, and Elon smoothly merged back onto the highway, the electric motor accelerating with quiet efficiency. In the back seat, The woman groaned softly, her breathing labored. One of the children started to cry, their small voice filling the car with a heartbreaking sound. "It's going to be okay," Elon said, glancing at the rearview mirror. "We'll get there in no time." The man nodded, his hands trembling as he tried to comfort his wife and children. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Let's just get your family safe," Elon replied, his focus unwavering as he guided the Tesla through the traffic. The drive was tense, every second feeling like an eternity. Elon kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel as the Tesla navigated with precision. The family's fear was palpable, their quiet murmurs and occasional cries a stark reminder of the urgency of the situation. But Elon's presence remained calm and steady, a beacon of reassurance in the midst of chaos. As they approached the hospital exit, Elon spoke again, his tone firm but kind. "We're almost there. Stay strong." The man nodded, his grip on his phone tightening. In the back seat, the woman let out another groan, her breathing quick and shallow. The children clung to her, their small hands clutching at her arms as though trying to hold her together. Finally, the hospital came into view, its bright lights a welcome sight against the darkening sky. Elon guided the Tesla smoothly into the emergency entrance, pulling up just as a team of medical staff rushed out with a stretcher. The screech of the Tesla's tires as it came to a halt by the emergency entrance drew the attention of several nurses and hospital staff outside. Before the car had even fully stopped, the man in the passenger seat was fumbling with the door handle, his panic overriding any sense of composure. He ran to his wife's side as the medical team rushed toward them, their faces calm but urgent as they assessed the situation. "She's pregnant," the man blurted, his voice shaking. "She's been having sharp pains for the past hour. I don't know what's wrong, but it's bad." One of the nurses nodded briskly and gestured toward the stretcher. "Let's get her inside. Sir, step back so we can work." As they eased the woman onto the stretcher, her face contorted in pain, the children clung tightly to her legs, refusing to let go. One of the nurses crouched down, her tone gentle but firm. "Sweethearts, we need to help your mommy now. Can you stand with your daddy for just a little bit?" Elon stepped forward, his presence as steady as ever, and crouched beside the children. "It's okay," he said softly. "Your mom's in good hands. I'll stay with you." The boy, who couldn't have been older than 6, looked up at Elon with tear-filled eyes. "Is mommy going to be okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. "She's going to be fine," Elon replied, his tone calm and reassuring. "The doctors here are really good. They'll take care of her." The medical team rushed the woman inside, leaving Elon, the man, and the 2 children standing by the Tesla. The tension was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The man ran a hand through his hair, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you. I mean it. Thank you." Before Elon could respond, the moment was interrupted by a loud, gruff voice coming from the parking lot entrance. "Hey, you can't just park your fancy car here like you own the place." Elon turned to see a security guard marching toward them, his expression sour and his posture aggressive. The man wore a uniform that looked a size too small, and his name badge read L. Grayson. His beady eyes were fixed on Elon, his tone laced with irritation. "This is a hospital," the guard snapped, jabbing a finger toward the Tesla. "Not a parking lot for your rich boy toys. Move it." Elon stayed calm, his expression unreadable as he stepped forward. "I understand your concern, but there's a family emergency. I brought them here because their car broke down on the highway." Grayson snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yeah, I'm sure that's a great story for the cameras. But I don't care who you are. Rules are rules. Move the car or I'll have it towed." The man, still visibly shaken, tried to interject. "Please, sir, my wife is inside, and she's—" "I'm not talking to you," Grayson snapped, cutting him off. "I'm talking to Mr. Moneybags over here." He gestured dismissively at Elon. "You think you're special just because you've got a fancy car? Newsflash, nobody cares. Get out of here." The tension ratcheted up another notch as the children clung to their father, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Elon held his ground, his calm demeanor unshaken by the guards' hostility. "This isn't about me," Elon said evenly. "It's about helping a family in need. If you'd like, I can move the car once they're settled." Grayson scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Oh, so now you're a hero? How convenient. You think I don't know your type? Flashy cars, big egos, always looking for attention. Well, guess what? I don't care who you are. Rules apply to everyone." The crowd of bystanders near the emergency entrance began to stir, their murmurs growing louder as they watched the scene unfold. A few had their phones out, recording the interaction, while others whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Elon and the guard. The man stepped forward again, his voice pleading. "Please, we're just trying to..." "Do I look like I care?" Grayson interrupted, his tone dripping with disdain. "This isn't my problem. You can cry about your sob story somewhere else." One of the bystanders, a young woman holding a toddler, frowned and called out, "Hey, give them a break. They just got here." Grayson whirled around, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. "Mind your own business," he barked. "You don't know what's going on here." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elon remained steady, his hands loosely at his sides as he addressed Grayson again. "You're right. You don't know what's going on here, but I do. This family is dealing with a medical emergency, and all they need is a little understanding. Can you do that?" Grayson glared at him, his face turning red with anger. "Don't talk down to me," he growled. "You think you can waltz in here and play the hero? Not on my watch." The children flinched at the raised voice, their small bodies pressing closer to their father. Elon glanced at them, his calm expression softening as he crouched down to their level. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe. Don't worry about him." The man clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. "This is ridiculous. My wife is inside, and she needs me. Are you really going to make this harder than it already is?" Grayson sneered, his gaze flicking to the Tesla. "If your wife's so important, maybe you should have thought about that before blocking the emergency entrance. Move the car or I'll call a tow truck. Your choice." The man looked helplessly at Elon, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the situation. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Elon straightened, his calm resolve unwavering. "We do what's right," he said simply, his eyes locking onto Grayson's. "And what's right is helping this family." The words hung in the air, a challenge that Grayson seemed unwilling to back down from. The guard's lips curled into a snarl, and for a moment, it seemed like he might escalate the situation further. But Elon stood firm, his presence steady and unshakable. The crowd watched in tense silence, the air electric with anticipation. Grayson's authority was being challenged, and his reaction would determine what happened next. The family, caught in the middle of the standoff, clung to each other, their fear and uncertainty written plainly across their faces. The moment stretched on, the tension reaching its breaking point. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot, it became clear that the situation was far from over. The tension between Elon and Grayson hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The guard's face was now flushed with frustration, his lips twisted in an exaggerated smirk as he crossed his arms over his chest. The growing crowd near the emergency entrance stood in silent anticipation, their phones held steady as they captured every word. Elon remained calm, his eyes locked on Grayson, while the family huddled close, the children clinging to their father. "All right," Grayson finally said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Since you seem to think you're so special, why don't you tell me exactly what makes you think you can ignore the rules? Let me guess, money? Fame? Or are you just used to getting your way?" Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "This isn't about me," he said simply. "It's about a family in crisis. I stopped to help them, and now we're here, wasting time that could be better spent making sure they're safe." Grayson laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Wasting time? You're the one who decided to stop and play superhero. If you'd just driven on, we wouldn't be having this conversation." A voice piped up from the crowd, loud enough to cut through the guard's tirade. "He's trying to help them. What are you even doing?" Grayson snapped his head around, his glare landing on the young man who had spoken. "You got something to say, kid?" he barked. "Because last I checked, you're not in charge here." The young man shrank back slightly, but his defiance didn't waver. "I'm just saying, maybe you should focus on helping people instead of yelling at the guy who's actually doing something." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective disapproval growing louder. Grayson's jaw tightened, his authority slipping further as the bystanders rallied behind Elon. He turned back to face the billionaire, his sneer returning with renewed intensity. "You've got them fooled," Grayson said, jabbing a finger toward the crowd. "But I see right through you. This is all just a stunt, isn't it? A way to get attention. Classic rich guy move." Elon's response was measured, his voice steady. "If helping a family in need is considered a stunt, then maybe more people should be pulling them." The retort landed like a punch, and for a moment, Grayson faltered, his bravado cracking under the weight of Elon's calm confidence. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his pride refusing to let him lose face in front of the crowd. "Don't think you can talk to me like that," Grayson snapped, his voice rising. "You might think you're untouchable, but you're on my turf now. And on my turf, you follow my rules." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their frustration with Grayson bubbling to the surface. A middle-aged woman near the front of the group shook her head, her arms crossed over her chest. "Your rules? This is a hospital parking lot, not your kingdom." Grayson's eyes darted to her, his expression darkening further. "You want to spend the night in a holding cell for obstruction? Because I can arrange that." The threat hung in the air, silencing the crowd momentarily. But Elon stepped forward, his presence commanding attention once again. "You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to be escalated," Elon said, his voice calm but firm. "This family needs support, not hostility. You're in a position to help them, and instead you're choosing to make it harder for everyone." Grayson's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. People like you don't impress me. You walk around like you own the world. But at the end of the day, you're just another guy with a big mouth and a fancy car." Elon remained unflinching, his steady gaze cutting through the guard's bluster. "I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to do the right thing. Can you say the same?" The question struck a nerve, and Grayson's face twisted with anger. His hands balled into fists at his sides, and for a moment it seemed like he might lash out. But instead, he took a step back, his smirk returning as he gestured toward the Tesla. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You want to play hero? Go ahead. But don't expect me to clean up your mess when this whole thing blows up in your face." As Grayson turned to stalk away, the man with the family stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Wait," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. "You don't get to just walk away after treating us like this." Grayson stopped in his tracks, his shoulders tensing as he turned back around. "Excuse me," he said, his tone laced with warning. "You heard me," the man said, his voice gaining strength. "We didn't ask for this situation, and we certainly didn't ask for you to make it worse. My wife is inside, fighting to stay strong for our kids, and all you've done is try to humiliate us." The crowd murmured in agreement, their support emboldening the man. Even his children, who had been clinging to him in fear, seemed to draw courage from his words. The little boy looked up at Grayson, his small voice cutting through the tension. "You're mean," the boy said simply, his wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. Grayson's sneer faltered, his gaze shifting between the man and his son. For a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. Guilt, perhaps, or shame, but it was quickly buried under his usual bravado. "Watch your mouth, kid," Grayson said, though his voice lacked its earlier venom. "You don't know who you're talking to." "He knows enough," Elon said, stepping forward once again. "And so does everyone else here. They see what you're doing, and they're not impressed." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement, their disapproval growing louder with each passing second. Grayson's authority was slipping further, his grip on the situation weakening as the tide turned against him. But instead of backing down, Grayson's pride pushed him to dig in deeper. "You think you're the good guy here," he said, his voice rising. "But you're just another meddler who doesn't know when to stay out of other people's business." Elon's response was calm but unyielding. "If standing up for a family in need makes me a meddler, then I'll wear that label proudly." The crowd cheered softly, their support bolstering Elon's position. Grayson's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over as he struggled to maintain control. But the writing was on the wall. His authority had been undermined, and the crowd was no longer on his side. As the tension reached a breaking point, Grayson let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Play your little hero games. But don't think for a second that you're better than me." Elon didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. The crowd watched intently, their collective anticipation growing as the standoff continued. The story was far from over, and the road ahead was sure to be even more tumultuous. Elon Musk remained standing in the same calm yet commanding position, his expression unchanging. The family stayed close together, the man gripping his children's hands tightly, while the little boy continued to glare at Grayson with the unflinching honesty only a child could muster. Grayson, however, looked as though he was unraveling, his confidence slipping, even as his ego refused to let him back down. "What's the matter?" Grayson growled, turning back toward the crowd with a sweeping glare. "You all think you're so much better than me? Standing there with your phones, whispering like cowards. Maybe you should step up and do something instead of letting this guy." He gestured roughly at Elon. "Act like he's saving the world." The crowd shifted, a few people looking uneasy, but others stood their ground. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap spoke up from the back. "We're not the ones yelling at a family in crisis," he said, his tone sharp and clear. "You've had every chance to de-escalate, but you just keep doubling down." "Why?" Grayson's glare snapped toward the man, his fists clenching. "You think you know how to do my job better than me? Is that it?" Elon took a small step forward, drawing Grayson's attention back. "This isn't about your job," Elon said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about compassion. You have an opportunity to show understanding and kindness, but instead, you're choosing to make the situation worse. Why is that?" The question seemed to catch Grayson off guard, and for a brief moment, his sneer faltered. But then his pride surged forward again, stronger and meaner than before. "Because I don't take orders from people like you," he spat. "You think just because you're rich and famous, you can come in here and tell me how to do my job? Newsflash. I don't care who you are." Elon's expression didn't waver. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about the family behind me. Can you see that?" Grayson let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if Elon had just said something absurd. "Of course it's about you," he snapped. "People like you always make it about yourselves. This whole thing, you stopping here, drawing a crowd, putting on a show. It's just another way for you to feel important." The family's father, who had been standing silently for most of the exchange, finally stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "That's enough," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "We didn't ask for any of this. We didn't ask for our car to break down, or for my wife to be rushed to the hospital, or for you to treat us like criminals. All we want is to make sure she's okay. And you're standing here making everything harder." Grayson's sneer deepened, but before he could respond, the little boy tugged on his father's hand and looked up at him. "Daddy, why is he so mad at us?" the boy asked, his voice filled with innocent confusion. The question struck a chord with the crowd, and a few people murmured in agreement. Grayson's face darkened, his posture growing more rigid as he tried to maintain control of the situation. "I'm not mad at you," he said, though his tone was far from convincing. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job?" a young woman near the front of the crowd said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your job is to yell at a kid and his dad while his mom's in the hospital? Great work. Really?" Grayson turned toward her, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "I'm trying to keep order here." That's my job. And how's that working out for you? Elon asked, his calm voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade. Because from where I'm standing, all I see is chaos. The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective disapproval growing louder with each passing moment. Grayson's face turned a deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over as he struggled to maintain control. But the cracks in his authority were becoming more and more visible, and the crowd wasn't backing down. You think you're so smart? Grayson growled, turning back to Elon, standing there acting like you're better than me. But let me tell you something, this is my turf. And on my turf, I make the rules. Rules are important, Elon said, his voice steady and deliberate. But so is knowing when to bend them. This isn't about you or me or even the rules. It's about doing what's right. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their support for Elon becoming more vocal. Grayson's face twisted into a snarl as he looked around, realizing that he was losing the battle for public opinion. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. You think you're some kind of hero? Grayson snapped, his voice rising. You're nothing but a show-off. A rich guy looking for attention. Elon didn't flinch. If helping a family in need makes me a show-off, then so be it, he said simply. I'll gladly wear that label. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their support for Elon drowning out Grayson's attempts to regain control. The guard's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration reaching a boiling point as he glared at Elon. This isn't over, Grayson growled, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can come in here and embarrass me? You've got another thing coming. The crowd's cheers began to fade as Grayson's threat hung in the air, casting a shadow over the otherwise triumphant moment. Elon remained calm, his eyes locked on the guard as he took a small step forward. This was never about embarrassing you, Elon said, his voice quiet but firm. It's about holding you accountable. You have a responsibility to help people, not hinder them. And right now, you're failing at that. The words landed like a blow, and for a brief moment, Grayson's sneer faltered. But then his pride surged forward again, stronger and meaner than before. You don't get to judge me, he snapped. You don't know anything about me. You're right, Elon said. I don't know you, but I do know that the choices you're making right now are defining who you are. Is this the person you want to be? Grayson's sneer grew sharper. The guard's authority, already on shaky ground, was being chipped away by every murmured comment and side-eye from the onlookers. But instead of backing down, Grayson seemed to thrive on the growing hostility, his pride feeding off the chaos. You know what your problem is? Grayson barked, pointing a thick finger at Elon. You don't respect the system. People like you think you can do whatever you want because you've got money and fame. But guess what? That doesn't mean squat to me. Out here, I call the shots. Elon remained silent for a moment, his gaze calm but piercing as he looked Grayson square in the eye. Respect isn't something you demand, Elon said finally. It's something you earn. And right now, you're losing it faster than you realize. The words struck like a hammer blow, and the crowd let out a collective gasp. Grayson's face turned crimson, his fists clenching at his sides as his body tensed. You've got some nerve, he growled, coming in here, acting like you're better than everyone else. Who do you think you are? Before Elon could respond, a woman's voice rang out from the crowd, clear and cutting. He's someone who actually stopped to help a family in need, she said, stepping forward. She was petite but confident, her sharp eyes boring into Grayson. Which is more than I can say for you. Grayson turned his glare on her, his jaw tightening. And who are you supposed to be? Another busybody who thinks they know everything? I'm someone who's seen enough of your bullying, the woman shot back, crossing her arms. You're not helping anyone. You're just throwing your weight around to feel important. The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration with Grayson growing louder. Elon said nothing, letting the woman's words hang in the air like a challenge. Grayson's sneer faltered for a moment, but then his bravado surged back, his voice rising above the noise. You all think you're so much better than me, he snarled, gesturing wildly at the crowd, standing there pointing fingers, acting like saints. But none of you would have stopped to help that family if he hadn't. He jabbed a finger toward Elon, his tone dripping with disdain. The family's father, who had been trying to comfort his children, stepped forward again, his face pale but resolute. "That's enough," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "You don't know anything about us or what we've been through. All we want is to make sure my wife is okay. And you're standing here making it all about yourself." Grayson turned his glare on the man, his lips curling into a sneer. "And you think you're some kind of hero? Standing there with your sob story, expecting everyone to drop everything for you?" The man's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Elon stepped between him and Grayson, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough," Elon said, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "This family doesn't owe you an explanation. They're here because they need help, not judgment." Grayson took a step forward, his chest puffed out as if trying to assert his dominance. "You don't get to tell me what's enough," he snapped. "You're not in charge here. I am." Elon didn't flinch, his steady gaze cutting through Grayson's bluster. "Then act like it," he said simply, "because right now all you're doing is making a bad situation worse." The crowd murmured in agreement, their support for Elon becoming more vocal. Grayson's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over as he struggled to maintain control. But the cracks in his authority were becoming more and more visible, and the crowd wasn't backing down. As if on cue, one of the children tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Why is the mean man yelling at Mr. Elon?" The innocent question sent a ripple of laughter through the crowd, and Grayson's face twisted in fury. He turned toward the boy, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is funny?" he snapped. "This isn't a joke." The father stepped in front of his son, his protective instincts kicking in. "Don't you dare talk to my child like that," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You've crossed the line." Grayson's jaw tightened, his fists clenching as he struggled to maintain his composure. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, and his tone grew even harsher. "Maybe if you taught your kids some respect, we wouldn't be in this mess." The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps, and a few people shouted out in protest. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and it was clear that Grayson had lost whatever shred of sympathy he might have had. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his voice rising as he tried to regain control of the situation. "You think you're all so much better than me?" Grayson shouted, his voice echoing through the parking lot. "You don't know what it's like to deal with people like this every day. You don't know the kind of disrespect I have to put up with." "And what about the respect you're showing?" Elon asked, his voice calm but firm. "Because from where I'm standing, you're not earning any." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their support for Elon drowning out Grayson's attempts to regain control. The guard's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over as he glared at Elon. "This isn't over," Grayson growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can come in here and embarrass me? You've got another thing coming." The family's father turned to Elon, his voice shaky but grateful. "Thank you," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Elon placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just did what anyone should do." Grayson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Anyone should do? Don't make me laugh. Nobody cares about anyone but themselves. That's the real world, Musk. Not your little billionaire fantasy." Elon's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened, a flicker of determination breaking through his usual composure. "Maybe that's the world you see," he said. "But that doesn't mean it's the only one. All right, Musk," Grayson sneered, his voice cutting sharply through the murmurs. "You've had your fun riling everyone up. But let's make one thing clear. You're not in charge here. And if you think you're walking out of this without consequences, you're delusional." Elon stood firm, his expression calm but focused, as if carefully weighing each word before responding. "I'm not here to undermine you," he replied, his voice low and steady. "I'm here to make sure this family gets the help they need. That's all this is about." Grayson barked a laugh, the sound harsh and grating. "Oh, sure. he said mockingly, throwing his arms up in exaggerated disbelief, because the guy who owns rockets and electric cars just happens to stumble onto a highway and suddenly becomes the world's good Samaritan. A man in the crowd, visibly irritated by Grayson's antics, stepped forward. His deep voice carried easily over the ambient noise. "He's done more in the last 20 minutes to help this family than you have," he said, his tone sharp. "Why don't you quit wasting everyone's time and do your job?" Grayson's head snapped toward the man like a whip, his glare now locked on a new target. "And who the hell are you to tell me how to do my job?" he snapped, pointing a finger at him. "You got something to say? Then step up." The man didn't flinch, crossing his arms and standing his ground. "Yeah, I do. Your job is to keep the peace, right? Well, congratulations. You're doing the opposite." The crowd murmured in agreement, their discontent growing louder. A woman near the front chimed in, her voice tinged with frustration. "We're all standing here because you can't let go of your ego. Just let the guy help them already." Grayson turned back toward Elon, his sneer growing sharper as the crowd's disapproval mounted. "You think you're a big man because these people are on your side?" he hissed, taking a step closer to Elon. "You're just another self-righteous billionaire who thinks he can do whatever he wants. But guess what? Your money doesn't mean anything here." Elon held his ground, his calm demeanor unwavering. "This isn't about money," he said evenly. "It's about doing what's right. Why is that so hard for you to understand?" Grayson's sneer twisted into something uglier, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "You think you're so noble, don't you?" he spat. "But you're no different than any of those other rich phonies who pretend to care just so they can get a pat on the back." The tension between them was electric, the crowd watching with bated breath as the standoff escalated further. But before Elon could respond, Grayson stepped closer, lowering his voice to a venomous hiss. "I don't buy your act, Musk," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You're just here for the cameras. Admit it." Elon's expression didn't falter. His eyes locked onto Grayson's with unflinching resolve. "You're entitled to your opinion," he said calmly. "But it doesn't change the fact that this family needed help. And I was in a position to provide it." Grayson scoffed, stepping back and turning to address the crowd. "Do you hear this guy?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "He's acting like some kind of saint, but he's just here to stroke his own ego. And you're all eating it up like sheep." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some people shouting back at Grayson, their frustration with him boiling over. One woman, holding a toddler on her hip, shook her head in disbelief. "You're the one with the ego problem," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "You've been picking a fight with him since he got here, and for what? Because he stopped to help?" Grayson's face darkened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He looked as though he wanted to shout back at her, but the weight of the crowd's growing disapproval seemed to finally chip away at his confidence. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. But instead of backing down, Grayson redirected his anger toward the family, his tone sharp and biting. "And you," he snapped, pointing at the man. "Maybe if you weren't so irresponsible, you wouldn't have gotten into this mess in the first place." The man's face flushed with anger, his hands trembling as he stepped forward. "My wife is inside fighting for her life," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And you have the audacity to call me irresponsible? Who do you think you are?" Grayson smirked, his confidence surging back as he sensed an opportunity to regain control. "I think I'm the one who's been cleaning up your mess," he said, his tone condescending. "And maybe you should take a good, hard look at yourself before you start blaming me for your problems." The crowd erupted into angry murmurs, their frustration with Grayson reaching a boiling point. One man shouted, "Leave them alone," while another yelled, "You're out of line." The tension was palpable, the air thick with anger and discontent. Elon stepped forward again, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough," he said, his tone carrying a quiet authority that silenced the crowd. "This family has been through enough without you adding to their pain." Grayson turned to face Elon, his sneer returning. "And what are you going to do about it?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Call one of your private jets to fly them out of here? Buy the hospital? What's your next big move, Musk? Elon didn't rise to the bait, his expression remaining calm. My next move is to make sure this family gets the help they need, he said simply. What's yours? You think you're better than me? Grayson growled, his voice low and dangerous. But you're just another rich guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him. Well, guess what? You're not above the law. And if you don't move that car, I'll have it towed. And there's nothing you can do about it. The crowd erupted into angry murmurs once again, their frustration with Grayson growing louder. But Elon remained calm, his gaze steady as he addressed the guard. You can do what you think is necessary, he said, his tone even. But ask yourself this. Will it help anyone? The question seemed to strike a nerve, and for a brief moment Grayson faltered. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, and he straightened his posture, his sneer returning. You don't get to question me, he said, his voice rising. I'm the one in charge here, not you. Grayson's chest puffed out as he paced back and forth, gesturing animatedly as if to reassert his dwindling authority. His tone grew louder, his insults more pointed, as he continued to berate the situation and the people around him. You think this circus is going to help anyone? He snapped, pointing toward Elon and then sweeping his arm toward the crowd. All you're doing is causing a scene. If any of you had half a brain, you'd see that one of the bystanders, a young woman holding a coffee cup, spoke up sharply. Causing a scene? You're the only one shouting. The rest of us are just watching you dig yourself deeper. The crowd laughed softly, their disdain for Grayson becoming more evident with each passing moment. But instead of backing down, Grayson turned his anger on the young woman, his sneer sharpening as he jabbed a finger in her direction. And what exactly are you doing here, huh? He barked. Standing around like a know-it-all? You think you're helping by running your mouth? Before the woman could respond, Elon stepped in, his voice calm but cutting. Enough, he said firmly, his tone carrying an authority that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. These people aren't the problem. The problem is your refusal to focus on what really matters. Grayson turned his glare back to Elon, his fists clenching as his pride refused to let him relent. What really matters, he snapped. You mean letting a bunch of rule breakers get away with whatever they want because some billionaire says so? Not on my watch. Elon's gaze remained steady, his calm demeanor unshaken. What really matters is helping this family. What really matters is showing compassion and understanding. What doesn't matter is your pride. The crowd murmured in agreement, their support for Elon growing louder. Grayson's face darkened, his frustration boiling over as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. But his anger only seemed to push him further into a corner, his sneer growing more pronounced as he doubled down. You think you can lecture me about pride? Grayson growled, taking a step closer to Elon. You don't know the first thing about me. You don't know what I've been through. The family's father, who had been standing quietly for most of the exchange, stepped forward, his voice trembling but resolute. We don't need to know what you've been through, he said, his tone sharp but controlled. We just need you to do your job and stop making things harder for us. Grayson turned his glare on the man, his lips curling into a sneer. Do my job? Is that what you think I'm doing wrong? Maybe if you weren't so incompetent, your wife wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. The words hung in the air like a slap, and the crowd gasped audibly, their murmurs of disapproval turning into angry protests. One man near the back shouted, "That's too far," while another woman added, "What's wrong with you?" The father's face turned pale, his hands trembling as he struggled to hold back tears. His young son tugged on his sleeve, looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Daddy, is Mommy going to be okay?" the boy asked softly. Elon crouched down to the boy's level, his expression softening as he addressed the child. "She's in good hands," he said gently. "The doctors here are very good, and they're doing everything they can to help her." The boy nodded slowly, his small hands clutching tightly at his father's pant leg. Elon straightened, his calm resolve returning as he turned his attention back to Grayson. "This family is already going through enough," he said, his tone firm but measured. Your job is to help, not to make things worse. Grayson scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. Spare me the lecture, he snapped. You think you're the big hero here, swooping in to save the day? Newsflash. Nobody asked you to. I don't need to be asked, Elon replied. When I see someone in need, I help. That's what decent people do. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their support for Elon becoming more vocal with each passing moment. Grayson's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over as he glared at Elon. You think you're so noble, don't you? Grayson snarled, his voice rising. But you're just another rich guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him. Well, let me tell you something, your money doesn't mean anything here. Out here, I'm in charge. Elon's response was calm and unflinching. Being in charge doesn't mean being cruel. It means being responsible. And right now, you're failing at that. The crowd cheered again, their voices rising in support of Elon. Grayson's sneer faltered for a moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he turned his attention back to the Tesla, his gaze narrowing as he pointed at the car. You think you're untouchable because you drive a fancy car? He said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Let's see how untouchable you are when I have it towed. Grayson pulled out his radio, his fingers hovering over the buttons as he prepared to call for a tow truck. But before he could press the button, a voice from the crowd shouted, "Don't you dare!" The voice belonged to an older man, his weathered face set in a stern expression as he stepped forward. "You're going to tow the car of the man who just saved a family?" The man said, his voice loud and clear. "What's wrong with you?" Grayson glared at the older man, his frustration boiling over. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "This isn't your business." "It is when you're abusing your authority," the older man shot back. "You're supposed to protect and serve, not bully and humiliate." The crowd erupted into cheers, their support for the older man adding to the growing pressure on Grayson. The security guard's face twisted in fury, his sneer deepening as he glared at the crowd. "You think you can all gang up on me and win?" Grayson snarled, his voice rising. "You think I'm just going to roll over because some billionaire and his fan club say so? Think again." The tension in the air was palpable, the crowd's disapproval growing louder as Grayson continued to lash out. Elon remained calm, his steady gaze cutting through the chaos as he addressed the guard once more. "This isn't about winning or losing," Elon said. "It's about doing the right thing. Can you do that?" Grayson's voice cracked through the air, venomous and loud, as he finally barked into his radio. "Dispatch, this is Grayson at the hospital entrance. I need a tow truck for an unauthorized vehicle immediately." The murmurs in the crowd grew into a rumble of disbelief and outrage. "Are you serious right now?" A woman in the front row shouted, her voice sharp and incredulous. "That car isn't hurting anyone, and you're calling a tow truck? What's wrong with you?" Grayson glared at her, his lips curling into a sneer. "You don't know the first thing about what's wrong with me, lady," he snapped. "But I'll tell you this. I'm not going to let some billionaire walk all over me." "You're not just walking over Elon," a man in the crowd interjected, his tone sharp. "You're walking over this family. You're punishing people who didn't do anything wrong. And for what? Your ego?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration with Grayson building as the guard visibly bristled at the accusation. "Ego," he spat, his voice rising in indignation. "You all think I'm the problem here? I'm just doing my job, keeping order. You think that Tesla has any more right to be here than anyone else?" Elon stepped forward, his calm demeanor cutting through the rising noise like a steady drumbeat. "This isn't about the car," he said, his voice even but firm. "It's about a family in crisis. Their situation should take precedence over parking rules or petty power struggles." Grayson laughed harshly, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "Precedence?" he echoed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Says the guy who probably bought his way out of every rule he's ever broken. Let me guess, Musk. If I offered you a parking ticket right now, you'd just pull out your checkbook and laugh, wouldn't you?" The accusation drew murmurs from the crowd, but Elon's calm demeanor didn't waver. "If a fine would help this family, I'd pay it," he said simply. But fines don't solve problems. People do. The statement landed like a thunderclap, and the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Grayson's face darkened further, his frustration reaching a boiling point as he glared at Elon. "You think you're so clever," he growled. "But this isn't your playground, Musk. Out here, you follow the rules like everyone else. And when the rules hurt more than they help, it's our responsibility to question them," Elon replied, his voice calm but pointed. "That's not being clever. That's being human." The crowd cheered again, their support for Elon growing louder as Grayson's authority continued to erode. But instead of backing down, the guard doubled down, his voice rising as he gestured wildly at the car and the family. "You think you can just waltz in here and make demands?" he snapped. "Well, guess what? I don't take orders from you or anyone else." Grayson's tirade was interrupted by the shrill sound of his radio crackling to life. A voice on the other end, likely from hospital security, sounded hesitant but firm. "Grayson, this is dispatch. We've got complaints about a disturbance at your location. Can you confirm?" The crowd murmured in anticipation, their eyes flicking between Grayson and Elon. The guard hesitated, his face a mask of frustration as he raised the radio to his mouth. "The only disturbance here is a billionaire trying to act like he owns the place." He barked into the device. "I'm handling it. Are you, though?" A voice from the crowd called out, the sarcasm cutting through the tension like a knife. Laughter rippled through the group, and Grayson's grip on the radio tightened as his face turned an even deeper shade of red. Elon didn't respond to the jab, his focus remaining on Grayson as he spoke. "No one's trying to undermine you," he said calmly, "but your actions are causing more harm than good. If this situation escalates further, it'll be because of your choices, not mine." Grayson's sneer sharpened, his frustration boiling over as he took a step closer to Elon. "You think you're so perfect," he hissed. "But you're just another entitled jerk who thinks the world owes him something." "I don't think the world owes me anything," Elon replied, his voice steady. "But I do believe we owe each other kindness and understanding. That's what makes us human." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective disapproval of Grayson growing louder. The guard's sneer faltered for a moment, but his pride refused to let him back down. Instead, he turned his attention back to the family, his tone sharp and condescending. "And you," he snapped, pointing at the father. "Maybe if you weren't so reckless, you wouldn't be in this mess. Ever think about that?" The man's face flushed with anger, his hands trembling as he stepped forward. "Reckless," he said, his voice shaking. "My wife is in the hospital, fighting for her life, and you're calling me reckless? What kind of person says that?" Grayson smirked, his tone turning even more condescending. "The kind of person who knows that actions have consequences," he said. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before putting your family in danger." The crowd erupted into angry murmurs, their frustration with Grayson reaching a fever pitch. One woman near the front shouted, "You're disgusting," while another man added, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Elon stepped between Grayson and the father, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough," he said, his tone carrying a quiet authority that silenced the crowd. "This family doesn't need your judgment. They need your help." Grayson's sneer twisted into something uglier, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "And what are you going to do about it?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Throw more money at the problem? That's all people like you know how to do." Elon's response was measured, his voice steady as he spoke. "Money doesn't solve everything," he said, "but compassion and action can. That's what I'm here to offer." The crowd cheered again, their support for Elon becoming more vocal with each passing moment. Grayson's face twisted in fury, his frustration boiling over as he glared at the billionaire. "This isn't over," Grayson growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can come in here and embarrass me? You've got another thing coming." The father, still trembling with anger from Grayson's scathing remark, took a step forward again, but Elon gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let me handle this," Elon said quietly, his voice steady and reassuring. The father hesitated but nodded, stepping back toward his children. Grayson's sneer grew sharper as he noticed the exchange. his tone dripping with disdain. "Oh, so now you're playing the noble protector," he spat. "What's next, Musk? Are you going to adopt the kids and buy them a mansion too? Spare us the hero act." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their collective frustration boiling over. A young man near the front of the group crossed his arms and called out, "At least he's doing something to help. What are you doing, besides making everything worse?" Grayson shot the man a glare that could have cut steel. "You don't know anything about what I do," he snapped. "It's easy to stand there and judge when you're not the one dealing with these situations every day." "And what situation is that?" the young man retorted, his voice rising with indignation. "A family in crisis? Or a guy with an ego the size of this parking lot?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Elon remained focused on Grayson. "No one here is against you, Grayson," Elon said, his voice calm and measured. "We just want to de-escalate this situation and focus on what really matters." Grayson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "De-escalate?" he repeated mockingly. "You think this is about de-escalation? This is about teaching people like you that you can't just waltz in and bend the rules whenever it suits you." Elon tilted his head slightly, studying Grayson with a calm intensity. "What rules are being bent here?" he asked evenly. "A family's car broke down. They parked it safely out of the way while dealing with a medical emergency. How is that breaking the rules?" Grayson's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "It's not about the car," he growled. "It's about people thinking they're above the law. It's about you thinking you can do whatever you want because you've got money and a name." The crowd murmured in disagreement, their discontent with Grayson's argument growing louder. A woman near the back shouted, "This isn't about money or fame. It's about helping people who need it." Grayson spun around, his glare sweeping over the crowd. "And what are you doing to help?" "Huh," he barked. "Standing there, running your mouths? You think that makes you better than me?" The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their frustration with Grayson reaching a fever pitch. A middle-aged man in a plaid shirt stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "We're not trying to be better than you," he said. "We're just trying to do the right thing. Maybe you should try it sometime." Grayson's sneer faltered for a moment, but his pride quickly reasserted itself. "You think you're so righteous," he snapped. "But none of you understand the pressure I'm under. None of you know what it's like to deal with people like this every day." "And what kind of people are they, Grayson?" Elon asked, his voice sharp but controlled. "People in need? People facing emergencies? Is that really so hard to empathize with?" Grayson turned his glare back to Elon, his expression hardening. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what I've been through, or what I deal with every day." "You're right," Elon replied. "I don't know your story, but I do know that your actions right now are defining how everyone here sees you. Is this who you want to be?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. For a brief moment, Grayson's posture softened, his sneer fading as if he were considering Elon's words. But then his pride surged forward again, his anger reigniting like a spark to dry kindling. "Don't try to psychoanalyze me, Musk," he snapped. "You don't get to stand there and act like you're better than me. You're just another rich guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him." "This isn't about me," Elon said simply. "It's about a family in need and how we choose to respond to them." Grayson scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Spare me the lecture," he said. "If you really cared, you'd leave and stop making a spectacle out of this." The crowd murmured in disagreement, their frustration with Grayson continuing to build. A young woman holding a child on her hip called out, "If he leaves, what happens to the family? Are you going to help them? Or are you just going to keep yelling?" Grayson turned to face her, his face a mask of frustration. "I don't owe anyone an explanation," he snapped. "And I certainly don't owe you anything." "You owe them compassion," Elon interjected, his voice calm but firm. "And if you can't offer that, at least don't stand in the way of those who can." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their support for Elon growing louder. Grayson's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over as he glared at the billionaire. "You think you're untouchable," Grayson growled, his voice low and dangerous. But you're not. If you keep pushing me, you're going to regret it. Elon didn't flinch, his gaze steady as he responded. This isn't about pushing you, he said. It's about standing up for what's right. Grayson's sneer twisted into something uglier, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. Right, he spat. Because you're the authority on what's right. Give me a break. You all think you've got me figured out, he growled, his voice rising above the murmurs. But none of you know the first thing about what it's like to keep order around here. Day after day, dealing with people who don't care about the rules, people who think they're special. The crowd shifted uneasily, some muttering among themselves while others crossed their arms in silent defiance. A teenage boy in the back called out, "Yeah, because helping a family with a medical emergency is such a crime, right?" Laughter rippled through the group, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. Grayson's face darkened, his lips curling into a snarl as he turned toward the boy. "Watch your mouth, kid," he snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." Elon stepped forward slightly, his calm presence commanding attention without raising his voice. "This isn't about rules, Grayson," he said evenly. "It's about decency. People aren't against you. They're against the way you're handling this situation." Grayson jabbed a finger in Elon's direction, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "And you think you're so much better? Walking in here with your fancy car and your big name, acting like you're above it all. You don't care about these people. You just want to look good in front of your fans." The accusation hung in the air, and for a moment, the crowd quieted, waiting for Elon's response. He remained composed, his gaze steady as he addressed Grayson. "If that's what you believe, then let's set aside who I am," he said. "Let's focus on the family that needs help. Can we agree on that?" Grayson scoffed, shaking his head. "Agree on what? That you're the hero here and I'm the villain? Spare me the moral high ground, Musk. You're no saint." The father of the family stepped forward again, his voice trembling but resolute. "No one's asking for a saint," he said. "We're asking for kindness. My wife is in that hospital, and all I want is to know she's okay. Is that really too much to ask?" Grayson turned his glare on the man, his expression hard and unyielding. "You think your problems are the only ones that matter?" he snapped. "There are rules for a reason. Maybe if you'd followed them, you wouldn't be in this mess." The crowd gasped audibly, their outrage spilling over into angry shouts. "That's enough," a woman near the front shouted. "How dare you blame them for what they're going through?" "Yeah," another voice chimed in. "You're supposed to be helping, not making things worse." Grayson's fists clenched at his sides, his face reddening as the backlash intensified. Yet, instead of backing down, he doubled down, his voice rising above the noise. "You all think you're so righteous," he snarled. "But none of you know what it's like to deal with this day in and day out. People lying, cheating, breaking the rules, and then crying when they get caught." Elon raised a hand, and the crowd quieted slightly, their attention shifting back to him. "No one's denying that your job is difficult," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But that doesn't excuse cruelty. If the rules don't allow for compassion, then maybe the rules need to change." Grayson laughed bitterly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Oh sure, let's just throw out the rules because Elon Musk says so. That's how the world works, right? Billionaires make the rules, and the rest of us just have to follow them." "This isn't about money or power," Elon replied. "It's about humanity. We're all responsible for each other, whether we're billionaires or security guards." The crowd erupted into cheers, their support for Elon growing louder with each passing moment. Grayson's sneer faltered for a brief moment, but his pride quickly reasserted itself, and he turned his anger back toward the Tesla. "You think you're so smart," he muttered, pulling out his radio again. "Let's see how smart you are when your precious car gets towed." The crowd's murmurs turned to shouts of protest, their frustration with Grayson reaching a boiling point. One man stepped forward, his voice firm and commanding. "If you tow that car, you're going to have to tow all of ours too," he said. "We're not letting you bully this family." The crowd murmured in agreement, a few people stepping forward in solidarity with the man. Grayson hesitated, his eyes darting between the crowd and Elon, his confidence visibly wavering. But instead of backing down, he raised his radio, his voice sharp and defiant as he barked into the device. "I need backup at the hospital entrance. Now!" The crowd gasped, their frustration boiling over into angry shouts. "Backup for what?" a woman shouted. "To harass a family and tow a car? This is ridiculous." Elon stepped forward again, his voice calm but resolute. "Grayson, this doesn't have to go any further," he said. "You can choose to de-escalate this. You can choose to help." Grayson's eyes burned with defiance as he lowered his radio, his sneer returning. "I don't take orders from you, Musk," he said. "And I sure as hell don't need your advice." The crowd erupted into boos and jeers, their discontent with Grayson reaching a fever pitch. Yet, amid the chaos, Elon remained calm, his gaze steady as he addressed the guard once more. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about doing what's right. And deep down, I think you know what that is." For a brief moment, Grayson's posture softened, his expression flickering with uncertainty. But the moment passed quickly, his pride surging forward once again as he turned his glare back to the crowd. "You all think you can gang up on me and win?" he snarled, his voice rising above the noise. "You think I'm just going to roll over because you're cheering for Musk? Think again. You've turned this into a circus," Grayson snarled, his voice trembling with anger. "I should have known someone like you couldn't just walk away quietly." Elon, ever calm, stood his ground. His presence wasn't dominating but deliberate, and it visibly irritated Grayson further. "No one's asking you to walk away, Grayson," Elon replied evenly. "But maybe it's time to listen. Not to me, not even to this crowd, but to yourself. Do you really believe what you're saying?" For the briefest of moments, Grayson seemed caught off guard. But the murmurs of agreement from the crowd only spurred his temper, and he turned on them again with renewed venom. "You think I care what any of you have to say?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the parking lot. "You don't know what it's like to deal with this kind of nonsense every day. You're all just here to rubberneck and record your little videos." From the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "Maybe if you weren't so busy yelling, you'd actually see the problem isn't the family or the car. It's you." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement, with a few people nodding and pointing toward the family. Grayson's eyes darted around, his authority slipping further with every comment. But instead of softening, his pride hardened like armor, and his voice grew louder. "You all want to play judge and jury," he snapped, pointing accusingly at the bystanders. "Fine, but don't come crying to me the next time someone breaks the rules and causes real problems. I'm the only one here trying to keep order." "Order," another voice rang out, this time a middle-aged man who had been quietly observing from the sidelines. He stepped forward, his face set in a stern expression. "You call this order? Yelling at a father while his wife is in the hospital? Threatening to tow a car that isn't in anyone's way? That's not order, that's bullying." Grayson whipped around to face the man, his expression twisting with indignation. "And who are you to tell me how to do my job?" he demanded, taking a step toward him. "You think you can just waltz in here and play the hero? Newsflash, you're not in charge here. No one's in charge of basic decency," the man shot back. "You don't need authority to show compassion. Maybe if you spent less time flexing your power and more time actually helping, this wouldn't be such a mess." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause punctuating the man's words like a challenge. Grayson's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. He turned back to Elon, his sneer sharper than ever. "You must feel pretty smug right now," he spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Everyone here thinks you're some kind of saint, but I see right through you. This is just another PR stunt, isn't it? Another way to stroke your ego." Elon's expression didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he responded. "If you think this is about ego, then you're missing the point entirely," he said, his tone calm but pointed. "This isn't about me. It's about doing what's right, even when it's inconvenient." Grayson laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Doing what's right? You don't know the first thing about doing what's right. You live in a world where consequences don't apply to you. But out here, in the real world, we have rules for a reason. And yet, the real world also requires compassion, Elon countered. Rules are meant to serve people, not the other way around. If they stop doing that, maybe it's time to rethink them. The crowd erupted into cheers again, their support for Elon growing louder with each passing moment. Grayson's sneer faltered slightly, but he quickly masked it with another wave of defiance. He turned back to his radio, barking into it with renewed urgency. "Get someone out here now," he shouted. "I'm not dealing with this circus by myself." The father of the family, who had been standing silently with his children, stepped forward again, his voice trembling but firm. "You're not dealing with anything," he said. "You're creating problems where there shouldn't be any. My wife is inside, fighting for her life, and all you've done is make it harder for us to be there for her." Grayson sneered at him, his tone condescending. "Maybe if you'd planned better, you wouldn't be in this mess. But no, you're happy to blame everyone else for your mistakes." The crowd gasped audibly, their murmurs turning into angry protests. "That's enough," a woman shouted, stepping forward with her arms crossed. "How dare you blame them for something that's out of their control?" "Yeah," another man chimed in. "You're supposed to be helping people, not tearing them down." Grayson's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. But the weight of the crowd's disapproval was becoming impossible to ignore, and his authority was crumbling with every passing moment. Still, his pride refused to let him back down, and his voice rose above the noise. "You all think you're so much better than me," he snarled, "but you're just standing there, judging me while I do my job. If you think you can do better, go ahead. But don't expect me to clean up your messes when it all falls apart." Grayson paced a short, angry circuit near the Tesla, gripping his radio like a lifeline. His voice had grown sharper, his tone more desperate, as he tried to reassert his authority. "You people need to understand something," he barked, pointing accusingly at the crowd. "I'm the one keeping this place in order. Without rules, everything falls apart. And if you can't see that, you're part of the problem." A voice rang out from the back, clear and cutting. "Rules don't matter if they're used to hurt people instead of helping them." A young woman stepped forward, her arms crossed and her gaze unwavering. "That family's car isn't in the way. No one here is in danger. You're the only one causing problems." Grayson snapped his head toward her, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "It's easy to stand there and judge when you don't have to deal with this kind of thing every day." "And what kind of thing is that?" the woman shot back. "A man trying to take his kids to see their mom in the hospital? Or a billionaire stopping to help? Which one is such a threat to you?" The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement, their frustration with Grayson bubbling over. Another voice chimed in, this time from a middle-aged man standing near the edge of the group. "She's right. You're not keeping order. You're just throwing your weight around because you can't handle being challenged." Grayson's sneer deepened, his frustration clearly mounting. "Oh, is that what you all think?" he said, his voice rising. "That I'm the bad guy here? Fine. Go ahead, side with Musk and his little fan club. But don't come crying to me when this place falls apart because no one follows the rules anymore." Elon stepped forward slightly, his calm voice cutting through the noise. "No one here is against rules, Grayson," he said. "What we're against is using them as an excuse to ignore basic humanity. Rules are meant to serve people, not control them." Grayson laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Easy for you to say," he sneered. "You've never had to enforce anything in your life. You just throw money at problems until they go away." Elon didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, his tone unwavering. "Throwing money at problems doesn't solve them. Neither does doubling down on hostility. What does help is listening, trying to understand, showing empathy." The crowd murmured in agreement, their support for Elon growing louder. Grayson's fists clenched at his sides, his face reddening as he struggled to maintain his footing. But the cracks in his authority were widening, and the more he lashed out, the more he alienated the people around him. The family's father stepped forward again, his voice trembling but firm. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable," he said. We're just trying to get through this nightmare. My wife is fighting for her life, and all we want is to be there for her. Is that really so much to ask? Grayson turned his glare on the man, his sneer twisting into something cruel. You think your problems are more important than anyone else's? He snapped. Maybe if you'd been more responsible, you wouldn't be in this mess to begin with. The crowd gasped audibly, their murmurs turning into angry protests. How dare you? A woman shouted, stepping forward with fire in her eyes. Blaming them for something out of their control? What's wrong with you? You're disgusting. Another man added, his voice sharp and cutting. This family is going through enough without you piling on. Grayson's sneer faltered for a brief moment, but his pride quickly reasserted itself. He raised his radio again, his tone sharp and defiant as he barked into it. Get back up here now. I'm not dealing with this circus by myself. Elon remained calm, his presence unshaken even as the tension continued to rise. Grayson, no one here is trying to undermine you, he said evenly. But the way you're handling this isn't helping anyone. It's not too late to change that. Grayson scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. Oh, spare me the motivational speech, he said. You think you're the hero of this story, don't you? But I see right through you, Musk. This is all about your ego. This isn't about me, Elon replied. It's about a family in need and how we choose to respond to them. The crowd cheered again, their voices rising in support of Elon. Grayson's sneer deepened, his frustration boiling over as he turned his attention back to the Tesla. If you think you're so untouchable, let's see how you feel when your precious car gets towed, he muttered, his hand hovering over the radio. You won't tow that car, a new voice said, cutting through the noise like a blade. An older man stepped forward, his posture straight and his tone commanding. Because if you do, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life. Grayson turned to face the man, his expression a mixture of defiance and unease. And who are you supposed to be? He snapped. Another Musk fanboy? I'm someone who knows when a line has been crossed, the older man replied. And you, Grayson, have crossed it. It's time for you to stop digging your heels in and start thinking about the consequences of your actions. The weight of the crowd's disdain hung heavily in the air, but Grayson seemed determined to power through it. His sneer etched deeper into his face as if it were armor against the growing tide of opposition. The crackle of his radio interrupted the rising murmurs. A voice, crisp and authoritative, came through. Grayson, what's your status? We're getting complaints from multiple witnesses about a disturbance. Do you need us to send someone to assist? Grayson raised the radio to his mouth, his tone sharp and defensive. The only disturbance here is Musk and his little fan club causing chaos in the parking lot. Send backup to help deal with this circus. Before he could finish, a voice from the crowd shouted, The only circus here is you. A younger man stepped forward, his arms crossed and his face full of defiance. You've been yelling at a family, a billionaire, and now us. Maybe it's time you look in the mirror. Grayson's eyes narrowed dangerously, and he turned to face the man, his tone dripping with venom. You've got a lot of nerve, he said, stepping closer. You think you're better than me? Standing there, spouting nonsense? The man didn't back down, his stance unwavering. No, I just know that yelling at a father while his wife's in the hospital doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a bully. The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement, their frustration with Grayson boiling over. Elon remained calm, watching the exchange with an expression that was both contemplative and resolute. When Grayson's gaze flicked toward him, it was clear that his patience had worn thin. You've been real quiet, Musk, Grayson said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Got nothing to say now that your little fanboys are doing the talking for you? Elon stepped forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. I've already said what needs to be said, he replied. But if you want me to repeat it, I will. This family is going through a crisis. They need help, not hostility. Grayson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Help? Is that what you think this is about? You're not helping anyone. You're just playing the hero so you can feel good about yourself. This isn't about feeling good, Elon said calmly. It's about doing what's right. something we're all capable of, if we choose it. The crowd erupted into applause, their support for Elon growing louder. Grayson's face twisted with anger, his frustration boiling over as he pointed accusingly at the Tesla. "You think you can just park wherever you want and get away with it?" he snapped. "You think your name and your money make you untouchable? Let me tell you something, Musk. Your car's getting towed whether you like it or not." Grayson raised his radio again, but the voice of an older woman cut through the tension. "You're really going to tow a car that's not blocking anything?" she asked, stepping forward with a pointed glare. "That's what you think is important right now?" Grayson turned toward her, his expression hardening. "What's important is that people follow the rules," he said sharply. "Otherwise, we end up with chaos." "Chaos?" the woman repeated, her tone incredulous. "The only chaos here is you yelling at a family in crisis and refusing to show an ounce of compassion." The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration with Grayson growing louder. Another voice chimed in, this time from a young man holding a phone. "And I'm pretty sure towing a car that isn't causing a problem isn't exactly following the rules either." Grayson's sneer deepened, his fists clenching at his sides as he turned his attention back to the family. His tone grew colder, more cutting, as he addressed the father directly. "You've got everyone here fooled," he said. "But I see through you. You're just another guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him. Maybe if you'd taken responsibility for your situation, your wife wouldn't be in that hospital." The crowd gasped audibly, their murmurs turning into angry protests. "That's enough," a man shouted, his voice filled with righteous indignation. "How dare you blame them for something out of their control?" "Yeah," another woman added. "What kind of person says something like that?" The father's face turned pale, his hands trembling as he struggled to hold back tears. Elon stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "You don't have to answer that," Elon said quietly. "He's not worth it." Grayson's sneer faltered for a moment, but his pride quickly reasserted itself. He turned his attention back to Elon, his tone laced with venom. "You think you're so noble, don't you?" he said. "But you're just another rich guy who thinks he can buy his way out of anything." "This isn't about money," Elon replied. "It's about compassion. Something that doesn't cost a thing." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in support of Elon. Grayson's face darkened further, his frustration boiling over as he glared at the billionaire. But before he could respond, the crackle of his radio interrupted the exchange. "Grayson, this is dispatch," the voice said. "We've got multiple complaints about your handling of the situation. Stand down and await further instructions." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their collective relief palpable. Grayson's face turned a deep shade of red, his hands shaking as he gripped the radio tightly. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his voice rising with defiance. "You think this is over?" he snarled, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You think you've won? Well, guess what? I'm not done yet." Elon remained calm, his gaze steady as he addressed Grayson. "It's not about winning or losing," he said. "It's about doing what's right. And it's never too late to start." Grayson's sneer deepened, his pride refusing to let him relent. The tension in the air was thick, the crowd's anticipation building as the standoff continued. Yet, amid the chaos, there was a growing sense that the tide was turning, and Grayson's grip on the situation was slipping further with each passing moment. The radio in Grayson's hand trembled slightly as the dispatch operator repeated their directive. "Grayson, you're instructed to stand down and de-escalate. Any further escalation will result in a formal investigation." The crowd's collective energy surged, their murmurs turning into a cascade of whispers and scattered applause. Elon Musk stood at the center of it all, his calm presence an unspoken anchor as the bystanders edged closer, emboldened by the latest development. Grayson, however, was a man unraveling in real time, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. He slammed the radio back onto his belt with a loud click and turned to the crowd with a glare that could have set fire to the asphalt. "You think this is funny?" he barked, his voice louder and more venomous than before. "You're all just standing there, clapping like fools. Do you have any idea what it's like to actually enforce the rules? To be the only one willing to do the hard thing? A teenage boy near the front of the crowd shouted back. Enforcing the rules doesn't mean being a jerk. You're just using them as an excuse to be cruel. Grayson's face twisted into a sneer, and he jabbed a finger in the boy's direction. Is that what you think? He snapped. That I'm being cruel? Maybe if people like you learned to follow the rules, I wouldn't have to enforce them. The boy's mother, standing beside him, stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. You're not enforcing anything, she said sharply. You're bullying a family that's already going through enough. Do you even hear yourself? The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder as more people spoke up. A man near the back added, You're making this about you instead of helping anyone. You've lost the plot, Grayson. Grayson whipped around to face the man, his fists clenching at his sides. I haven't lost anything, he growled. You're all just too blind to see what's really going on here. Musk shows up and suddenly, everyone's against me. Typical. Elon stepped forward slightly, his calm voice cutting through the noise. This isn't about me, Grayson, he said evenly. It's about the choices you're making right now. You can either double down on hostility or choose a better path. It's up to you. Grayson barked a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Spare me the life lessons, Musk, he said. You don't know what it's like to have to fight for respect every day. You don't know what it's like to deal with people who think they're better than you. I don't know your story, Elon admitted, but I do know that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. And right now, you're losing it. The crowd erupted into applause, their support for Elon growing louder with each passing moment. Grayson's sneer deepened, his frustration boiling over as he turned his attention back to the Tesla. His voice grew sharper, his tone more desperate as he barked his next words. You think you're untouchable, Musk? He snapped. Let's see how untouchable you feel when your precious car gets towed. He raised his radio again, as if to summon the tow truck despite the dispatcher's earlier orders. But before he could speak, an older man stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face set in a stern expression. His voice rang out, calm but commanding. That's enough, Grayson, the man said. You're not helping anyone, and you know it. Grayson turned to face him, his sneer faltering slightly as he took in the older man's composed demeanor. And who are you supposed to be? He asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Another Musk fanboy? I'm someone who's seen enough of this, the older man replied. And I think it's time you started asking yourself what you're really trying to accomplish here. The crowd murmured in agreement, their support for the older man adding to the growing pressure on Grayson. His face darkened, his fists clenching tighter as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. But the cracks in his authority were becoming more and more visible, and it was clear that the tide was turning against him. Grayson turned his glare back to Elon, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. You think you've won, he snarled. You think you can just walk in here and make me look like the bad guy? This isn't about winning or losing, Elon said calmly. It's about doing the right thing. And it's not too late for you to do that. Grayson laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Oh, spare me the lecture, he said. You think you're some kind of saint, don't you? But you're just another rich guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him. This isn't about me, Elon replied, his tone steady. It's about how we treat each other in moments like this. That's what really matters. The crowd erupted into cheers again, their voices rising in support of Elon. Grayson's face twisted with anger, his frustration boiling over as he glared at the billionaire. But the more he lashed out, the more isolated he became, and the crowd's disapproval was impossible to ignore. A woman near the front of the crowd stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear. You're not the victim here, Grayson, she said. You're the one causing all this. Stop blaming everyone else for your own behavior. Grayson's sneer faltered again, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might back down. But his pride quickly reasserted itself, and he lashed out once more, his voice rising with defiance. You all think you're so much better than me, he snarled, but you're just standing there, pointing fingers. None of you would last a day doing my job. Maybe not, Elon said, But that doesn't excuse cruelty. It's not about how hard your job is. It's about how you choose to do it. The radio at his hip crackled again, and the dispatch operator's voice came through once more, firmer this time. Grayson, we've received further complaints about your conduct. You're ordered to cease escalation immediately. If you proceed with further actions, you'll be held accountable. Grayson gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening as he stared down at the radio. His hand twitched as though he might grab it and shout back, but he stopped himself, his gaze darting toward Elon. This is all because of you, he hissed, his voice low but filled with venom. You just couldn't leave well enough alone? Could you? Elon remained composed, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to Grayson's growing fury. This isn't about me, Grayson, he said. It's about how you're choosing to handle this situation. No one's forcing you to escalate. Grayson barked a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You're unbelievable, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Standing there acting like you're some kind of moral authority. But you're just another guy with too much money and not enough sense. A man in the crowd, visibly irritated, called out, "At least he's doing something to help. What are you doing, besides yelling and making everything worse?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration with Grayson building like a tidal wave. Another voice joined in, this time a young woman holding her phone. Maybe if you spent less time barking orders and more time actually listening, you'd see who the real problem is here. Grayson whipped around to face the woman, his sneer sharpening. "Oh, I'm the problem?" he snapped. "That's rich. Coming from someone who's probably never had to enforce a rule in her life." The woman didn't flinch, her gaze steady as she responded. "You're not enforcing rules. You're using them as an excuse to act like a bully. And everyone here can see it." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in unison against Grayson's behavior. His face darkened further, his frustration boiling over as he struggled to maintain his authority. But the more he lashed out, the more isolated he became. "Enough!" Grayson bellowed, his voice rising above the noise. "You all think you can gang up on me and win? You think Musk is some kind of hero? Let me tell you something, he doesn't care about you. None of these billionaires do." Elon stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about me or my resources, Grayson," he said. "It's about a family in need and how we choose to respond to them. This isn't a competition. It's a test of compassion." Grayson scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Compassion?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "You think compassion solves problems? You think it pays the bills, keeps people in line? Get real. Compassion doesn't replace structure," Elon replied. "But it makes that structure worth following. Without it, all you have are rules that no one respects." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause echoing through the parking lot. Grayson's face twisted with anger, his frustration boiling over as he glared at Elon. But before he could respond, another voice from the crowd rang out. "You're not keeping anyone in line," the voice said, cutting through the noise like a blade. An older woman stepped forward, her expression fierce and her tone unwavering. "You're just making everyone hate you. Is that really what you want?" Grayson turned toward her, his sneer faltering for the first time. "I don't care what they think," he snapped. "I'm not here to win a popularity contest." "Then what are you here for?" the woman asked sharply. "To prove you're the loudest, angriest person in the room? Congratulations, you've already won." The crowd laughed, their support for the woman's words only adding to the pressure on Grayson. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his composure. But the tide was turning against him, and it was becoming increasingly clear that his authority was slipping away. Elon stepped forward again, his tone calm but pointed. "Grayson, no one here wants to see you fail," he said. "We just want to see you make the right choice. You can still turn this around." Grayson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Turn it around?" he repeated. "You think I'm going to take advice from you? From a guy who's probably never had to deal with a real problem in his life." "This isn't about me," Elon replied evenly. "It's about the people standing right in front of you. They're not your enemies, Grayson. They're just asking for kindness." The crowd erupted into cheers again, their voices rising in support of Elon. Grayson's sneer twisted into something uglier, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. But instead of softening, he lashed out once more, his voice sharp and defiant. "You all think you're so much better than me," he snarled, his voice trembling with rage. "But you're just standing there, judging me while I do my job. None of you have the guts to do what I do every day." "No one's asking for guts," a man in the crowd replied, his voice calm but firm. "We're asking for decency. That's what this is about." The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration with Grayson reaching a fever pitch. Yet, amid the chaos, Elon remained calm, his steady presence a stark contrast to Grayson's growing desperation. "I'll tell you who I am," Grayson growled. "I'm the one who keeps order while everyone else loses their heads. And if you don't like it, that's too bad." The tension in the air was palpable, the crowd's frustration reaching a boiling point as Grayson's defiance continued to escalate. Yet, amid the chaos, there was a growing sense that the tide was about to turn, that Grayson's grip on the situation was slipping further with each passing moment. His attempts to maintain control were now almost theatrical, a desperate act of defiance against the inevitability of his crumbling authority. The crowd had moved from passive observation to outright condemnation, and Elon Musk's calm, steady presence only seemed to amplify the growing unrest. Grayson's frustration was palpable, a volatile mixture of anger, wounded pride, and an ever-diminishing sense of power. Grayson's voice rang out again, loud and trembling with indignation. "You all act like you're better than me," he spat, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "But you're just standing there, throwing stones while I'm the only one actually doing anything." A young woman near the front crossed her arms and retorted, "Doing what, exactly? Making a scene? Harassing a family in crisis? That's not doing something, Grayson. It's just being a bully." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder as more people chimed in. Another man shouted, "You're not enforcing rules. You're hiding behind them because you can't admit you're wrong." Grayson whipped around to face the man, his face flushed with anger. "Wrong," he barked. "I'm not the one who broke the rules. That's on them." He jabbed a finger toward the family near the Tesla, his tone dripping with disdain. "Maybe if they had some respect for the rules, we wouldn't be in this mess." The father of the family, who had remained quiet for much of the exchange, finally stepped forward. His voice was low but steady, and his words carried the weight of a man who had been pushed too far. "Respect," he said. "You want to talk about respect? My wife is in that hospital, fighting for her life, and you're out here blaming us for trying to be with her. If that's your idea of respect, you can keep it." The crowd erupted into applause, their support for the father echoing across the parking lot. Grayson's sneer deepened, his fists clenching at his sides as he glared at the man. "Don't play the victim with me," he growled. "You think your sob story gives you a free pass? Rules are rules, and compassion is compassion," Elon interjected, his voice calm but firm. "If the rules don't allow for compassion, then maybe it's time to question the rules." Grayson turned his glare on Elon, his voice trembling with rage. "You don't get to lecture me about compassion," he snapped. "You're just another rich guy who thinks he's above it all." "This isn't about me," Elon replied evenly. "It's about how we treat each other in moments like this. That's what defines us. Not money, not power, but our humanity." The crowd cheered again, their voices rising in support of Elon. Grayson's face darkened further, his frustration boiling over as he turned his attention back to the Tesla. "You think you're so untouchable, Musk," he snarled. "Let's see how untouchable you feel when your car's being towed." He raised his radio again, but before he could speak, a voice from the crowd cut through the noise. "Go ahead and try," an older man said, stepping forward with a stern expression. "But if you do, you're going to have a lot more than just Elon to answer to." Grayson froze, his gaze snapping to the man. "And who are you supposed to be?" he demanded, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I'm someone who's tired of watching you dig yourself deeper," the man replied. "It's time to stop, Grayson." Before it's too late, the crowd murmured in agreement, their support for the older man adding to the growing pressure on Grayson. His sneer faltered slightly, but his pride quickly reasserted itself. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he snapped. "None of you do. I'm the one in charge here." "In charge of what?" a woman near the back called out. "Making everyone hate you? Congratulations. You've done a great job." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Grayson's face turned an even deeper shade of red. His fists clenched tighter, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his composure. But the cracks in his authority were becoming impossible to ignore. Elon stepped forward slightly, his calm gaze fixed on Grayson. "No one here wants to see you fail," he said. "But the more you dig in, the harder it's going to be to climb out. You can still make this right." Grayson laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Right," he said. "Like you'd know anything about making things right. You've never had to fight for anything in your life." "You don't know me, Grayson," Elon replied. "And I don't know your story. But I do know that everyone here is ready to forgive you if you choose to change course." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices soft but supportive. For a brief moment, Grayson's posture softened, and a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a sneer that was sharper than ever. "You all think you're so righteous," he snarled, "but you're just standing there, pointing fingers. None of you have the guts to do what I do every day." The heat of the moment was oppressive, the parking lot now a cauldron of simmering frustration and volatile tension. Grayson's face was a mask of fury, his sneer sharper than ever as he gripped the radio in one hand and clenched his fist with the other. The crowd had become a singular force, united in their opposition, and Elon Musk's calm presence only seemed to widen the chasm between Grayson and the people he was supposed to serve. But then Grayson did something no one expected. In a fit of rage, he reached for the side of his belt. Not the radio this time, but the holster carrying a sleek, black sidearm. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he pulled the weapon free, the metallic glint catching the light. He raised it not at anyone directly but at the Tesla parked nearby. The movement was fast, desperate, and tinged with something unhinged. "Back off," Grayson bellowed, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "All of you, I'm done listening to this nonsense." The crowd froze in stunned silence, their disbelief etched across their faces. Some people instinctively backed away, while others stood rooted in place, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. A young woman near the front clutched her phone tighter, recording every second of the escalating chaos. Elon Musk didn't flinch. His gaze shifted slightly, assessing Grayson with the kind of sharp, calculating look that had likely served him well in boardrooms and launchpads. Slowly, deliberately, Elon took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Grayson," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't the way." Grayson's laugh was bitter and unhinged, the sound of a man clinging to a crumbling sense of control. "Oh, now you're going to tell me how to do my job," he sneered. "What do you know about pressure, Musk? What do you know about people like me?" "This isn't about pressure," Elon replied, his tone measured. "It's about choices. You're at a crossroads, and the next step you take will define everything." Grayson's grip on the gun tightened, his knuckles whitening as he waved it toward the Tesla. "You think I care about your philosophical garbage?" he shouted. "All I care about is showing people like you that you don't get to walk all over me." The crowd murmured in alarm, their fear and outrage growing with every second. A middle-aged man near the back of the group called out, "This isn't how you prove anything. Grayson, put the gun down before you make things worse." "Shut up," Grayson snapped, his voice trembling with rage. "You don't get to tell me what to do. None of you do." The father of the family, who had been standing protectively near his children, stepped forward cautiously. His voice was low but steady, carrying the weight of a man who had faced more than his share of struggles. "Grayson," he said, "you don't have to do this. Whatever you're feeling right now, this isn't the answer." Grayson's gaze snapped to the father, his expression twisting into a sneer. "Don't pretend you care," he growled. "You're just like the rest of them. Ready to judge me without knowing anything about me? No one's judging you, the father replied. We're trying to help you, but you've got to meet us halfway. The gun wavered slightly in Grayson's hand, a flicker of hesitation that didn't go unnoticed. Elon seized the moment, his voice calm but insistent. You can still choose a different path, he said. Put the gun down, Grayson. Let's figure this out together. Grayson's laugh was bitter and hollow, his eyes darting between Elon and the crowd. Together? He echoed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You think I'm going to stand here and take orders from you? From any of you? Without warning, Grayson shifted his aim slightly and fired a single shot. The deafening crack of the gun echoed through the parking lot, and the crowd gasped in unison. The bullet struck the pavement near the Tesla's front tire, sending a burst of gravel and dust into the air. Stay back, Grayson shouted, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. I mean it. Don't test me. The crowd recoiled, their fear palpable as they edged further away. But Elon remained where he was, his expression calm despite the tension crackling in the air. No one's testing you, Grayson, he said. We're just trying to help you step back from the edge. Grayson shook his head violently, his breathing ragged as he pointed the gun at the ground again. You don't get it, he shouted. None of you get it. I'm tired of being walked on, disrespected, treated like I don't matter. Elon's tone softened, his words deliberate and measured. You do matter, he said, but this isn't the way to show it. What you're doing right now, it's not who you are. How do you know who I am? Grayson shot back, his voice cracking. You don't know anything about me. I know you're human, Elon replied, and I know that means you're capable of making better choices. It's not too late. The gun wavered again, the weight of Elon's words cutting through the haze of Grayson's anger. The crowd watched in tense silence, their collective breath held as the scene teetered on the edge of chaos. A voice from the crowd broke the silence, clear and resolute. Grayson, listen to him. Put the gun down before you do something you can't take back. Grayson's grip on the weapon tightened, but his sneer faltered slightly, replaced by something more vulnerable. A flicker of doubt, perhaps, or recognition. His gaze shifted to the crowd, then to Elon, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lower the gun. But his pride surged forward again, hardening his expression. You think this changes anything? He snarled. You think I'm just going to back down because you're all ganging up on me? No one's ganging up on you, Elon said. We're standing with you, Grayson. There's a difference. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The crowd watched intently, their collective energy shifting from fear to something more hopeful. Grayson's posture softened slightly, the gun dipping lower as his breathing steadied. But the moment was fleeting, his pride reasserting itself like a reflex. He straightened his posture, his sneer returning as he barked at the crowd. Don't think this means I'm done, he said. You don't get to tell me how this ends. The crowd remained silent, their expressions a mixture of caution and quiet resolve. Elon's gaze never wavered, his calm presence a steadying force in the midst of the turmoil. The standoff wasn't over, but the cracks in Grayson's armor were widening. The road ahead promised a dramatic reckoning that would bring everything to a head. The stillness that followed the gunshot was suffocating, as though the entire parking lot had been vacuum-sealed in fear. Grayson stood trembling, his chest heaving, the gun still in his grip as his eyes darted wildly between the crowd and Elon Musk. He had reached a tipping point, and the cracks in his facade of authority had given way to something far more erratic. The onlookers held their breath, unsure of what the unhinged guard might do next. A child in the crowd whimpered, clutching her mother's leg, and the sound seemed to pierce through the heavy tension. Grayson flinched, his head snapping toward the noise. "Shut that kid up," he barked, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm trying to think." The mother's protective instincts flared, and she pulled her daughter closer, glaring at Grayson. "You're out of control," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Put the gun down before you hurt someone." Grayson laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "Oh, I'm the one out of control," he snapped, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You're all standing there, ganging up on me, and I'm the one who's out of control? Yes, a voice shouted from the back. You just fired a gun. What do you think this looks like? Grayson spun toward the voice, his gun raising slightly in a gesture that sent a ripple of panic through the crowd. People stepped back, hands raised in fear, their murmurs growing louder as they questioned whether it was still safe to stay. Don't test me, Grayson bellowed, his voice raw with emotion. I'm not afraid to use this again. Elon Musk stepped forward slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. His calm demeanor seemed to slice through the hysteria, and his voice was steady when he spoke. Grayson, this isn't you, he said. You're not this person. Put the gun down before it's too late. Grayson's laugh was wild and unhinged, his eyes darting back and forth as though he was looking for an escape route. You don't get it, do you? He snarled. It's already too late. None of this matters anymore. In a frantic gesture, he aimed the gun at the Tesla again, his finger twitching on the trigger. You think I'm afraid of you, Musk? You think your money and your name make you untouchable? The crowd gasped, their fear palpable as Grayson's finger tightened on the trigger. But before he could fire, a middle-aged man in the crowd stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. Grayson, stop, he shouted. This isn't worth it. You're throwing your life away over nothing. Grayson turned on the man, his face twisted with rage. You think I care? He yelled. You think my life means anything to any of you? You're all just waiting for me to fail, so you can laugh about it later. No one's laughing, the man replied, his voice steady despite the tension. We're scared for you, for everyone, but it doesn't have to end like this. Grayson's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of something almost like doubt, but his grip on the gun remained tight, and his posture stayed rigid. It's easy for you to say, he muttered, his voice trembling. You're not the one who spent their whole life being walked on. Neither is Musk, a young woman interjected, her voice sharp. And yet, here he is trying to help you. You're the only one acting like the enemy. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder as more people spoke up. But the chorus of reason only seemed to make Grayson more volatile. He spun in a circle, the gun waving dangerously as he shouted, "Shut up! All of you! Just shut up!" The tension reached a breaking point as Grayson's movements became erratic. His breathing was heavy and uneven, his face flushed with anger and fear. Elon took another step forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a steady beacon. Grayson, listen to me, he said. You're not alone. Whatever you're feeling, whatever's brought you to this point, you don't have to carry it by yourself. But you have to let go of the gun. Grayson shook his head violently, his laugh bitter and hollow. You don't get it, he said. You'll never get it. And then, as if to prove his point, he fired another shot, this time into the air. The deafening crack sent the crowd scattering, people diving for cover as the sound echoed across the parking lot. A few bystanders screamed, their fear finally spilling over into panic. Elon remained standing, his expression calm but focused. You're scaring people, Grayson, he said. Is that what you want? To make people afraid of you? Grayson froze, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. His hand trembled slightly, the gun dipping lower as his breathing grew more ragged. For a moment, it seemed as though Elon's words had reached him, cutting through the haze of anger and desperation. But then, the sound of police sirens in the distance shattered the fragile moment of silence. Grayson's head snapped toward the noise, his face twisting into a mask of panic. You called the cops? He shouted, his voice rising with hysteria. You think they're going to fix this? No one called them, Elon said calmly. They're here because the situation got out of control. But it's not too late to fix it. You can still choose to end this peacefully. Grayson's grip on the gun tightened again, his body tense as the flashing lights of police cars came into view. The crowd parted nervously, giving the officers a wide berth as they approached with their weapons drawn. Drop the gun, one of the officers shouted, his voice amplified by a megaphone. Put it down now. Grayson's eyes darted wildly between the police, the crowd, and Elon. His entire body seemed to shake as he stood there, caught between fight and flight, his pride and fear warring for control. The officers moved closer, their weapons trained on him, their voices steady but firm. "Grayson," Elon said, his voice cutting through the chaos once more. "It's over. Put the gun down before someone gets hurt." Grayson's hands trembled violently, the weight of the weapon seemingly too much for him to bear. He let out a choked, desperate laugh, his pride finally giving way to something raw and broken. "You think this fixes anything?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You think any of this matters?" With a final, ragged breath, Grayson let the gun slip from his grasp, the metallic clatter echoing across the parking lot as it hit the pavement. The officers moved in quickly, restraining him as the crowd erupted into a mixture of cheers and sighs of relief. Grayson didn't resist, his body slumping as though the fight had drained out of him entirely. Elon watched silently, his expression a mixture of relief and quiet contemplation. The chaos had subsided, but the fallout was just beginning. The chaotic energy that had consumed the parking lot finally gave way to an eerie stillness as Grayson was led away in handcuffs. The once defiant guard now looked smaller somehow. His shoulders slumped and his head bowed. The crowd watched in silence, their collective relief palpable but tinged with unease. For all his flaws and anger, Grayson's downfall was a stark reminder of how quickly pride and fear could unravel a person. The officers gently guided him into the back seat of a patrol car, and as the vehicle pulled away, the murmurs of the crowd began to swell. People exchanged glances, whispered comments, and reassured one another that the ordeal was over. But the lingering tension suggested that the memory of what had just transpired would stay with them for a long time. Elon Musk stood near the family's car, his hands in his pockets and his expression contemplative. The father of the family approached him cautiously, his children trailing behind. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he spoke. "Mr. Musk, I don't even know how to thank you. If you hadn't been here..." "You don't have to thank me," Elon interrupted gently, his gaze meeting the man's. "I just did what anyone should do. This wasn't about me. It was about making sure your family got the support they needed." The father's eyes glistened with gratitude, and he extended a hand. "Even so, thank you. For staying calm, for standing up to him. It meant everything." Elon shook his hand firmly, offering a small nod before turning to the children. He crouched slightly to meet their eyes, his voice softening. "Your mom is going to be okay," he said, his tone filled with quiet reassurance. "And your dad's stronger than he realizes." The younger child clung to her father's leg, while the older one gave a small, hesitant smile. "Are you really Elon Musk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elon chuckled, a lightness returning to his demeanor. "That's what they tell me," he said, winking. "But today, I'm just someone who wanted to help." The girl's smile grew wider, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out a small piece of paper. "Can you sign this?" she asked shyly. Elon obliged, pulling a pen from his jacket and scribbling his signature with a flourish. "There you go," he said, handing it back to her. A little reminder that even big problems can be solved with kindness. As the family moved to their car, the crowd began to thin, people returning to their vehicles and their lives, though their conversations remained focused on the events they had just witnessed. A few stopped to thank Elon personally, shaking his hand or simply nodding in appreciation. He acknowledged each gesture with quiet humility, his focus clearly on ensuring that everyone felt heard and valued. One of the bystanders, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached him hesitantly. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said. "You didn't have to stay, but you did. And the way you handled everything, it was inspiring." Elon smiled faintly, his gaze thoughtful. "I stayed because it was the right thing to do," he said. "Sometimes, doing the right thing is all we can do." As the crowd finally dispersed, Elon turned back to his Tesla, inspecting the car briefly before opening the door. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the frame as he looked out over the now quiet parking lot. His expression was pensive, as though he were reflecting on the weight of what had just occurred. Before he could get inside, The older man who had confronted Grayson earlier stepped forward. "Musk," he called out, his voice steady. "I don't know if you realize it, but you made a real difference today." Elon turned to face him, his brow furrowed slightly. "It wasn't just me," he said. The crowd stood up too. "Sometimes it takes a group effort to remind someone of what's right." The man nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Still, it wouldn't have happened without you. You didn't just de-escalate. You showed all of us how to stay human when things get tough." Elon considered the man's words for a moment before nodding. "We're all human," he said. "That's the point. It's easy to lose sight of that when emotions run high. But it's the most important thing to remember." The man extended a hand, which Elon shook firmly. "Well, I hope you know how much it meant. Not just to that family, but to everyone here." As the man walked away, Elon finally slid into the driver's seat of his Tesla, the soft hum of the engine filling the quiet as he started the car. He glanced in the rearview mirror, taking one last look at the hospital in the distance before pulling out of the parking lot. Later that evening, as news of the incident began to circulate online, clips of Elon's calm demeanor and steady words went viral. The story wasn't about his wealth or fame. It was about how he had used his influence to bring a sense of humanity to a situation teetering on the edge of chaos. The headlines were varied but carried the same core message. Elon Musk steps in to defuse dangerous standoff, proves compassion still matters. Viewers from around the world shared their thoughts in the comments, many expressing admiration not just for Elon's actions, but for the way the crowd had come together to support the family. The event became a talking point, a moment of reflection on how small acts of kindness and courage could ripple outward and inspire change. And somewhere in a quiet home, a little girl held onto a signed piece of paper, a tangible reminder of the day she learned that even the most unlikely heroes could be found in the middle of an ordinary parking lot. What does it mean to truly step up when it matters most? Today, we witnessed an extraordinary moment that wasn't just about a family in crisis or a volatile guard losing his way. It was about humanity, about the choices we make when faced with tension, injustice, and fear. Elon Musk didn't need to stay. He didn't need to speak up. Yet he did, showing all of us the power of calm, steady compassion in the face of chaos. But this story isn't just about Elon. It's about a father standing strong for his family, a crowd coming together to demand decency, and even us, as viewers, reflecting on what we do in a moment like this. Grayson's actions may have left many of us angry, but let's think about the bigger lesson here. His outburst came from a place of deep frustration, a feeling many of us can relate to at some point in our lives. The difference lies in how we handle those moments. Do we lash out and make things worse? Or do we pause, breathe, and choose compassion over pride? This story reminds us of the power we all have to de-escalate conflict, to stand up for what's right, and to support one another even in the toughest situations. Sometimes doing the right thing means speaking up. Sometimes it means listening. So what about you? How would you have handled this situation? Let us know in the comments, because real change begins with honest conversations. And remember, kindness isn't weakness. It's the greatest strength of all. If the story resonated with you, share it. Let's inspire more moments of humanity, one story at a time.